everyone. My name is Naomi Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of Clowns Without Borders USA. I am delighted to be here this week with William Paul Simmons, who wrote the book Joyful Human Rights. The blurb on the book says, focusing on joy shifts the way we view victims, perpetrators, activists, and martyrs, and mitigates our propensity to express paternalistic or heroic attitudes towards human rights victims. There is so much to talk about, and Bill, I'd love to start with what got you started with the book. Earlier, you had said that you spent 25 years being a human rights worker, but mostly you focused on human rights abuses. So I'd love to hear more about that. Sorry, construction.
Even when you're hanging out with supposed victims, you're finding that those people are, full human beings, that they experience a range of emotions, including happiness and joy. And they're not just, wallowing in their misery. They live full lives. And yet, when I taught human rights and mentored human rights activists and practitioners, I realized that we were covering a genocide every week. It was genocide, torture, sexual violence, apartheid. And I could say that, even though I've been teaching human rights for 25 years, I've really been teaching human rights abuses for 25 years. And so hanging out with practitioners and others, I just felt that we needed a corrective. We needed to look at the positive side of our human rights work and the victories that human rights folks have gained.
Thank you so much. Something that we find a lot in our work, and when we talk about joy, and as Clowns Without Borders, we get to meet people living in incredibly hard circumstances, but we get to meet them in a moment of joy. And often in talking with donors or doing interviews, or there's a perception of our work as like, oh wow, the clowns are doing this great work for these poor people, and that's something that it's really exciting through the lens of clowning to shift that narrative, that very paternalistic narrative, and also to shed light on the whole human experience. And I always say that there are audience members who show up and want to play. There's an incredible story from some of the clowns who are performing on the beaches of Lesbos, Greece, and were performing for kids who were still damp from crossing the Mediterranean. And this incredible moment of realizing these kids who had just gone through this traumatic experience were there and ready to play. And also, we make sure that our shows are free and voluntary, because it's just as important that for anyone who doesn't want to play, they don't have to play. And in the introduction of the book, you have this Emma Goldman quote that I'm going to read, because I think it also speaks to the work of people who work in the human rights field, and how to combat this idea that to do the work, you can only do the work if you're being serious. Right. So she wrote, I did not believe that a cause which stood for a beautiful idea, for anarchism, for release and freedom from convention and prejudice, should demand the denial of life and joy. I insisted that our cause could not expect me to become a nun, and that the movement would not be turned into a cloister. If it meant that, I did not want it. I want freedom, the right to self-expression, everybody's right to beautiful, radiant things. And I just love that, and I'm wondering if you could talk about everyone's right to radiant, beautiful things, and yeah.
Yeah, wow. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about, the people at Lesbos, I mean, it's like, like you said, it has to be voluntary, right? Everybody's on this journey together, and everybody's on a journey that, there's going to be times when people aren't going to want to play. There's going to be times when people aren't going to find joy in what they're having, of course. And some people are going to find anger and resentment as to what happened to them, but only pigeonholing them in that area and say, oh, you must be a horrible, your life must be horrible. All we want to hear about is your horrible story crossing the Aegean Sea or something like that. That's really reducing them in a way like the dictators reduce them, right? Trying to take away their full humanness. And so when I hear, the right to radiant and beautiful things, I'm thinking, first of all, I mean, this is an anarchist saying, things, that you should have things and you should have moments and you should have happiness. And too often we take ourselves so seriously in this work, and we, and it's interesting, I'm really curious as to how, I mean, you all must feel like, I mean, I know what, my limited knowledge of clowning, I mean, it's a very serious enterprise. And so like when you're on the plane coming into Lesbos, or you're, flying into Sudan or Haiti, I mean, it must be an incredible feeling of, I have to do this, this, and this. And yet at the same time, not taking ourselves so seriously, right? So that we, the cause, that she talks about is a serious cause, but it doesn't have to be fought for seriously. And in fact, that seems to get in the way of what we're trying to do. So, I mean, I think, these rights to play, rights to, beautiful, radiant things, rights to happiness, right to joy, these are things we don't talk about because, we're human rights practitioners or academics. We must be serious. We're dealing with torture and we're dealing with all this other stuff. And yet, if we do that, we risk making the same mistakes that, people who perpetrate human rights abuses do, is we take ourselves too seriously. We think our answers are the only answers, and we don't listen to the people we're working with, right? I mean, if you see somebody as a victim, you open your wallet and you want to hand them a credit card, that's what they need. And it's not what they need. I mean, it is obviously a tool, but, people, need to have a place to develop their full humanity. And, for us to do that with just a tone of seriousness just seems to be missing the boat. So.
Yeah, I'm reminded, Justin Allen, who's one of the performers who performed with us last year in the Balkans, he said, it's our work is to put on the best possible show for our audience because they're going through a lot, and yet they're choosing to give their attention to the clowns. And for him, like, that to me really sums up the, like, how do we as the clowns keep from being too serious? Because I definitely have to remind myself of, okay, it is my job to be here as a clown. I've chosen, I've identified that's the way I want to make impact in the world and within this community, and I have to hold myself to that, because it can be hard, in these moments of looking around and seeing, oh my gosh, but like also there's food scarcity here, and also, we're doing this show in a school, and I've just been told that there are a lot of kids who can't come to school because they don't have because there are landmines that prevent them from having a safe path to school. And that observation from Dustin, that's like, it's our job to put on a show, because that we create an opportunity for the audience to choose if they want to give their attention to the clowns. And
have you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but have you
interrupt
ever,
me.
I mean, like when I'm, in January, I went with one of my students to the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. And when I do things like that, I'm on a plane and I'm thinking, I'm going there to help these people. And what have I brought? I've got a pen, I've got a laptop computer, I've got a video camera. It's like, I mean, I assume you feel kind of the same way. It's like, I'm going to go into the Balkans and I have a red nose. it's like there's a certain amount of foolishness in what we do, right? And I'm not putting down what you do. I'm just saying that, there's a certain vulnerability in that, if you're not doing that with a certain amount of humility, it just seems odd to me that, I can go into a place, if I was cocky and thought, wow, I'm going to go in and I'm going to make all these people feel good and I'm going to do this, this, and this. That's, it's a certain amount of foolishness and ridiculousness to think that we can do this and yet we can, but, it's just kind of, it just strikes me as kind of silly in a way. A friend of mine talks about, human rights workers as fools. And and in the best way possible, she means that. And I like that.
Well, foolishness and vulnerability are the two things, the height of what I strive for, and I think the height of what CWB strives for, and humility is a big part of that. And certainly there are clown characters who are not humble, but it is one of the pieces that we really look for in casting our performers, is a humility, and then also a cultural humility, and that piece of understanding that, okay, if I have a show that works really well for a paying audience, I might perform that for, I might arrive in a refugee camp and people don't want to see it, or it's not funny, and it's my job as the fool, as the clown, to accept and respond to that, right? I don't get to say, oh, but my last audience really liked it, right? Like, it's my job to say, okay, this isn't working. What are the big feelings that I can react, and how can I create permission and play around either the whole audience or a few audience members being like, no, we don't think it's funny. And some of the best things that happen in our show are actually these intentional moments where we as the clowns create opportunities for someone in the audience to be the star of the show. And often that's bringing a kid on stage, or if there's somebody, sometimes it's the school principal, or if there's somebody who's standing like this and kind of making side comments that other people are laughing at, it's our job as the clowns to sort of say, like, okay, actually he's the funniest person in the room, let's bring him on stage. And so I think, for me, the foolishness and vulnerability, that is the work. And I want to go back to something you said earlier about the big feelings, and how often in human rights work and discourse we kind of only focus on a narrow range of big feelings, and something that clowns do is feel big feelings. And while we often talk about laughter and joy, the clowns also show frustration and conflict, and that for a lot of audience members, that's the moment where connection happens. And you write about how joy, anger, and pride expand our sense of identity, but how they're kind of often absent from research. And I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, wow. Such big questions about big emotions. When I started writing a book about joy, I didn't think I would be writing about anger, right? And how much joy actually is connected to anger, and how much, and I guess what happened was that I realized that the mainstream human rights scholars, mainstream political theorists and philosophers, they have kind of poo-pooed joy and anger both, right? And famous philosopher said something like, anger has no productive value. And I thought, wow, that's a very privileged position. right? Because you're telling me that if I've, survived apartheid, and this is a great anecdote was somebody made a film about reconciliation in South Africa, thinking that everybody would be kumbaya at the end, and they were following how this famous torturer was apologizing to the family of this guy he killed, and his son, who had never met his father, was maybe 15 years old, and he's in the back of the room as this apology is going on. And next thing you know, you see him pick up a lamp and crash it over this guy's head, the guy who had tortured and killed his father. And I was like, and so this movie that was supposed to be about reconciliation is really about anger. And who are we to say that anger is not appropriate in that place, right? I mean, when we say that anger is inappropriate, we're basically saying, no, you have to reconcile yourself to the current situation. And so I think, anger is absolutely, a valid emotion, and to shut that off is shutting off so much that could be healthy for a person to move forward. And if we shut off anger, we're also not listening to the person who's angry, right? And I think that's the hardest part for activists, is when somebody in their movement is angry at them, because we kind of get defensive and we start saying, no, don't you realize I'm helping all these people? I'm doing stuff right, and then we don't listen to the person and listen patiently to their anger and what are their complaints, and are we at fault in some way? And so that, you see social movements, break up over, one person speaking out in anger, and the rest of the movement just can't take that. They can't take criticism like that, because we're not being foolish, right? We're not being vulnerable and realizing we can be wrong. So that's how I kind of got into anger. And anger and pride and joy all tap into something deeper about us, that we realize something, who we are through expressing those emotions. We think of a better possibility, right? A new world can be possible because, I realize I should be angry and I should not like the way the world is as it is. And the philosopher Albert Camus, the French writer, he says, like, rebellion is both a yes and a no. And the no is like, no, I'm not going to take this anymore. This is not tolerable. But then the yes is like, what are we, going to build out of this? How am I going to affirm life as well in this? And I think, that's one of the things with Clowns Without Borders, just thinking about it here, is that, it's not just, from what I understand of your work, it's not just making fun, right? I mean, there's a message behind this. There's you all also have the workshops and the other projects that you do, and you build up things as well. So it's not just laughter. There's a program behind it. And I think that's so important to have, both the no as expressed in anger, or, self, the pride and saying that I deserve, my rights, but then also, have a program behind it to build something out of it. So.
And I think also I'm just thinking about social movements or groups breaking up when someone is angry, that tragic irony of to be working towards the freedom of expression, but then not being able to meet some expressions. And it's similar, and there have definitely been tours or projects and performers, moments of struggle. I mean, we work towards the right to play, and it can also be hard in these moments where you see that there's a, oh my gosh, but I've designed a workshop or we have a performance, but actually there's a soccer ball, and that's really how this group of kids want to be playing, and it's hard to let go of that piece of me that's like, but I came here, I traveled to do this, and to say like, oh wait, the right to play, how great that there's this choice of how to play, and I think especially in nonprofit work, and then also in human rights work, this feeling of needing to defend the work and to justify the work, to justify every donation.
Yeah.
I know I've had moments where I then lose sight of, oh wait, actually the freedom of expression and the right to play means that I'm putting that above, but I want to be able to say that there were 150 people who attended this workshop, and that is really the piece of humility. And I'm now going to challenge you on where you talk about your limited knowledge of clowns, because you wrote an incredible history of clowns as activists going back to the Middle Ages. And so I would love some key moments from your history of clowns.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I don't know much more than what I wrote in the book. I mean, so, you know, if there's any clown scholars out there, you know, you win already. You're absolutely right. I was wrong. I didn't know what I was talking about. But I think every society seems to have somebody that we would label as clowns or jesters or fools, and it almost seems to be something that is required to have some kind of release valve, some kind of somebody who's going to make us look less serious, and you know, to remind us of happiness, to remind us of bodily functions, right? I mean, you know, that's you know, it's funny how clowns are tied to bodily functions, right? Like I know there was a jester in the Middle Ages, and I guess in England, and he was given a plot of land to retire on, but it was like the king also wrote, you have to come every year to the palace, and you have to joke and something and fart for us every year. And it's like, wow, that's okay. You know, it's just like, you know, we need that to take ourselves less seriously. And so, you know, from the jesters who were able to be the one who could tell the king bad news or to criticize the king, you know, that's really such an important function, you know, especially when there wasn't freedom of expression. And then you have I talk about the Holy Fools, which is, you know, a passion of mine in Russia. I mean, you know, everybody knows St. Basil's Cathedral with the beautiful onion tops. But, you know, St. Basil was a holy fool. He was not somebody you would consider as a saint, but he was somebody who walked around, we think, naked, both summer and winter. And he would harangue Ivan the Terrible as he went to the cathedral every day. And he could speak truth to power. And he would do things like go up to rich people's houses and throw rocks at their windows all night, you know, just to harass them. And do things like, I think my favorite is during Lent, he walked up to Ivan the Terrible and gave him a big slab of meat. And Ivan the Terrible's like, no, it's Lent. I can't do that. That's a sin. And he's like, yeah, but you murder people every day, you know? And so it's like, well, you know, so, and they made this guy a saint, and apparently Ivan the Terrible, you know, was served as one of his pallbearers, as, you know, and so I think, you know, all societies seem to have these kinds of clown figures that, you know, are able to express themselves and express things that aren't normally spoken about. And I'll just mention, I do a lot of work in the Gambia in West Africa. And back in the day when there was a lot of HIV/AIDS prevention, the question was, how do you talk about safe sex in a society that is very Muslim, very religious, and one NGO enlisted a group of women called clowns. They were, and sorry, I have landscapers here, so, and a dog barking, so I can't take myself too seriously. But in the society, in these Mandinka villages, women who were widowers and who were past childbearing age were originally considered worthless. And so what they did, the women banded together and they formed acting groups and singing groups. And basically, over time, it became part of the custom that they could talk about anything that they wanted to, and nobody could shut them up. And so when people wanted to do HIV/AIDS prevention, they enlisted the clowns, these women, because they could speak about anything. And so the clowns, the women could go and do a performance under a tree, and they could pull out a phallus and show how a condom goes on. But nobody else could in the whole village. And so they became really pivotal figures, you know. And so this idea of being able to say whatever you want is really productive in a lot of ways.
Thanks. I think that's so important of thinking about thinking about the clown as the outsider and the power to that. I mean, that's one of the ways that often CWB artists talk about feeling like artists is that incredible privilege of being, you know, of having a ticket out, right? Of that piece of going to a refugee camp or going to a site of natural disaster, a community that's identified itself as being in crisis and being a visitor, and that can create this incredible power dynamic and sense of being an outsider. And I think a lot of the beauty of our work can happen when we as clowns can own that as outsiders, that's a way that we can make an impact, right? And it doesn't, and instead of apologizing for that outsider status of saying, okay, what's the way that then we can play with this? And especially since for CWB, I mean, we do human rights work, but we're not the NGO workers we're not in a position of power to distribute food or visas. We are a very different face of aid workers, and sometimes that owning that outsider status and having these moments of not knowing the rules or of falling down and falling down and falling down can celebrate that difference. And for anyone who's just joining on Facebook Live, thank you, welcome. I'm here with William Paul Simmons discussing his book, Joyful Human Rights, which is about a joy-based approach to thinking about both human rights activism and then as a lens of looking at human rights abuses. And the next,
Naomi,
yeah.
can I follow up on that? I mean, I think it's interesting that, you know, when most aid workers go in, they are in a place of power, right? But yeah, you know, you talked about the little boy in the corner who you bring up to be the star of the show. And what I understand is when that happens, you're usually, you're kind of the butt of the jokes, right? I mean, you know, they take power over you. And I wonder if one of the, you know, one of the really important pieces of Clowns Without Borders is that it shows white people or people from the global north as the, you know, as the butt of the humor, as that, you know, for once that 7-year-old boy has power over you, right? He is the one who, you know, is the smarter one in the room. He sees the gag going on and you don't, right? And so I just wonder if, you know, there's like another layer of humility going on, and a layer that refugee kids or whoever don't normally see.
Yeah, I think that and sometimes that's quite explicit. Alex, the jester who was on a tour to Haiti following Hurricane Matthew, he said that one of our project partners, who is a nurse practitioner running a clinic, she said, you know, the clowns are the first white people who haven't tried to teach us anything. And
Wow.
you know, and that piece of, you know, that was kind of and Alex shared that with me, that the really helped us reframe of how do we think about this work, especially for a long time, our Clowns Without Borders started, in a very Eurocentric model. And as being teams, we used to have a model of all of our teams were clowns coming from the US or coming from Europe. And that's something that we've really worked to shift, and but also to play with that. And one of the aid workers, the UNHCR aid workers at Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, said up, that the clown show was the first time that he felt like as an aid worker, he could stand shoulder to shoulder in an equal position with the beneficiaries of aid. And so I think that piece of, especially of when white performers are performing in places that have had white colonizers, which is most of the world, that to play with that, to be the butt of the joke. And my clown is very takes herself very seriously, and also is always falling down, is always, it's like the harder I try, the more I try to control everything, the more I fall, the more I fail. And that piece of being the butt of the joke, I mean, that is the piece that's relatable. And I think especially, aid, there are, 70 million displaced people in the world. It is, an incredible effort to organize aid. And also there is a lot of redundancy. There is a lot of bureaucracy. There are a lot of challenges, and those are experienced by beneficiaries of aid. And I think when we as clowns can play that a little, can acknowledge that, then that also creates an outlet and that moment of saying, hey, you're seen.
Yeah, and and it ties back to what you were talking about with. Sorry, I lost my train of thought as my dog is barking. But coming in and not knowing what you're going to do, or thinking you're going to do something, and then you realize, wow, this is not going to work. And so, like for the Bangladesh trip in January, people kept asking me and my grad student, well, what's your research protocol? And I'm like, God, I have no idea. I'm like, I've never been there. I don't know. And over the years, I've come up with these grand research designs. And then as soon as I walk into a place, I realize, no, that's the dumbest idea I've ever had. Let's cross that out. And, that's not what's going to work here in this culture with these people. And so, but this idea that, maybe what's going to help is, just being a person, just doing whatever. And so this last trip, I just got in the habit of sitting down with kids and opening a coloring book and just coloring with them. And it became very clear. I mean, the teachers are like, no, you shouldn't do that because you need to be standing up and you're the white person and you need to be the person who's organizing everything. And I'm like, no, I think the kids right now just want to have somebody to draw with them and to somehow, relate to them as to what they're doing. It just seems like sometimes, that soccer ball is probably, great. Let's play soccer. Let's do that. But then again, I mean, you're an organization that has, I know you have a huge staff of 2, so, you have to pay the bills, you have to pay the cats, or feed the cats, as one of my friends always says, you have to please the donors. And so there is that tension too, right? That but, while all the other NGOs are playing, this bureaucratic game, it just seems like we don't need to play that as well. It seems like, especially as, being clowns, it seems like you have license to do that.
And I think owning, recognizing that creativity and the strength of creativity, something that Nicole just reminded me of, is also how, given enough space and emotional relief, people are able to be more creative and have their own ideas, and often those times where you think in either or patterns, it's that comes from a place of stress, and it's in the moments of like something that can be really exciting is to see throughout the progression of an afternoon that the clowns might spend in a community is at the beginning playing might be pretty narrow. It might be like one of the clowns proposes a game and that's the way the game is played, and by the end of the show it's that power has shifted, or the creativity has shifted so that it's kids or adults who are proposing the games. And that's I think the clowns who have just the incredible strength at that are hospital clowns. And because that's all about, you know, clowns in teams coming in, starting a game between the clowns, and then inviting a response and inviting the child to, or the patient to take the lead. And you write a bit about hospital clowning specifically and the assumptive world, and how we have assumptions of who belongs in certain spaces, and clowns, except for rodeos and circuses, clowns are rarely part of those worlds. So I would love to know a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks. So assumptive world theory is that there's a world that how we assume it is, and I think the way the theory was created is got a certain privilege to it, that it assumes that we all believe the world is benevolent, that most people are kind, and that I have some meaning as a person. Now, there's a lot of people around the globe who don't hold those beliefs, right? And then, but having said that, I think it's really useful theory in that when we experience trauma, that we lose the sense of purpose. We lose the sense that the world is a fair place. We lose the sense that other people are kind and willing to help me out. And so my place in the world is disrupted. So like I was on a certain trajectory, and then the trauma happens, and now I'm on another trajectory, and I didn't want to be on that trajectory. And so one of the things that I really like is post-traumatic growth as a theory instead of post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic growth says, okay, now you're on a new trajectory. Now it's time to create that trajectory the way you want to create it, and to find meaning, find what the world means to you and all that. And so when we go through something like, you know, children who in a hospital who have, you know, very serious diseases, tragedies happening to them, they are used to trying to, you know, they're going to be putting their lives, trying to make sense of their lives, and it's been shattered as to what they think is appropriate. And that, according to post-traumatic growth theory, is also kind of a place where it's possible to introduce new meaning. It's a place because your trajectory, your sense of self has been disrupted, and now we can create something new. And yet the thing that we're creating at that time in many hospitals, and hospitals have gotten so much better at this, right? That it used to be, you know, children's wards in hospitals were pretty dire places, right? And everybody was seen as a victim, et cetera. And, but in that world of machines beeping and, you know, doctors and nurses running in and out, and you have to have your medicine at this time because, right, and this is going to hurt a little bit, you know, you need another IV, you know, that continuous thing. All of a sudden you introduce clowns to that environment. You know, what a disruption, you know. I didn't expect this to walk in, and I'm not even sure what this is, but this is different. And all of a sudden they involve me in their play. And again, that idea that I have some control over the play that they, you know, I think that's, you know, a piece of the empathy that clowns have, is that they can see where, you know, how to empower the audience, right? That this is something that the audience needs. This is something, and that's something, most doctors, nurses, et cetera, are not really trained at. And so for, the first time since I've been in this hospital room, I actually have power over this, and I can kind of create the situation. I mean, I think that's incredibly powerful. And a few scholars have studied the effects of hospital clowns. And that's what they find, is that not only the kids, but then the parents are like changed by these performances. And then also the doctors and nurses are changed, and they behave differently after the clowns leave. And I think that's profound. I mean, I don't know enough about it to say when that's appropriate, when it's not. I think, again, goes to the foolishness of being a clown, right? That, with my nose, I'm going to somehow change things. And yet you're able to do it over and over and over, right? Which has got to give you all kinds of confidence, but also, how do you balance the confidence and the humility? I think that's just, really interesting, and what we do as scholars and what you all do as clowns.
And I think more than my nose giving me confidence, it's that it amplifies my curiosity, and so that really what I'm doing is following my curiosity. And something a few months ago, we did a panel with a group of incredible hospital clowns from Humorology Atlanta, Laughter League, and the Medical Clown Project, and then a clown who had been part of Big Apple Clown Cares. And something that they all said in a few different ways. One is that as a clown, you get to see the child and not the symptom, or you get to see the human and not the disease. And that, again, that's part of that power of being an outsider, because a doctor, a caretaker can't necessarily do that. And also another piece that every hospital clown I've talked to has brought up is that the clown is the only person a patient can say no to. If you're a patient, you don't get to say, actually no, I'm gonna skip that IV, or please don't wake me up, please don't wake me up, period, but please don't wake me up every hour. And that place where, again, as a performer, it takes that humility of how to greet that no as a success, and how to say, actually, a patient saying no to me, a child, me saying, hey, want to come on stage, and a child saying, no, I don't want to come on stage. Listening to that is part of honoring the freedom of expression, and is part of listening. Oh, and we have some comments coming from two incredible clowns. Erin is saying, my red nose is an invitation. And Colleen is saying that her red nose is a beacon for play. And that reminds me, Becca, the juggler, she said that she wears a nose, and sometimes she wears a nose because she can see it. The nose is big enough so that she has this little red horizon, and it as she plays, and that she can always see her nose, and it reminds her to kind of to follow the play, as I now pretend to.
Well, and that's really cool. You're talking about like next level humility or advanced humility, right? I mean, so like I can be humble going into a situation. Now I was real curious about going back to the Rohingya camps in May. COVID prevented that, but now that I've been there and I've got a research protocol in my head, now what if I go back and it doesn't work? Like, will I be open enough to say, especially now I've got a research team and I've got all this and I've got grad students writing master's theses on this, now will I still say, well, no, freedom of expression means that they don't want to be part of this, or will I say, no, this is going to be good for you. I mean, I mean, and I love that, the constant reminder of having the red horizon, right? And, you know, and to, you know, respect those wishes. That's really, you know, that's something to strive for, I think.
I want to zoom out a little. In the chapter on joyful activists, you open with a story about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and actually the night he was assassinated, which is a story that's pretty well known. And your frame of the story was completely new to me. I was not expecting in that story to see the word clowning or the word pillow fight. And I'm wondering if you could tell that story.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, thanks for that. And one of the great things about writing a book on a topic that nobody's ever really written about is I could pick and choose whatever stories I wanted. And so I was like, oh, I always love this story. I'm going to weave this in somehow. Or, you know, I love Clowns Without Borders. Okay, so how do I frame a chapter around Clowns Without Borders? So, yeah, so the April 4th, 1968, right? We know Martin Luther King was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, but most people don't know that an hour before he was engaged in a fierce pillow fight with his colleagues, you know, the who's who of the civil rights movement. Ralph Abernathy was there, Andrew Young, Martin Luther King's brother was there, A.D. King, and James Orange. I mean, these are towering figures in the civil rights movement. And what happened was Andrew Young, who's later UN representative to the United Nations, he had been in court all day, and Martin Luther King the night before had given his mountaintop speech, right? So, but he wasn't feeling well, and so Martin Luther King decided not to go to court, and he was staying at home, or staying in the room at the hotel, and had been trying to hear all day from Andrew Young, like, what's the progress? Can we march tomorrow? Can we do this? And Andrew Young was on the stand and trying, all day trying to get Martin Luther King the right to march the next day. And so he wasn't able to respond to the notes that kept coming in. And so when Andrew Young came into the hotel room, Martin Luther King yells at him, like, you got to tell me what's going on. And Andrew Young's like, no, don't you realize I was trying to get you the right to vote? Or the right to march. I didn't have a chance to say anything. And Martin Luther King, in his frustration, grabbed a pillow and started hitting Andrew Young, which led Ralph Abernathy to grab a pillow, which led, to have this huge pillow fight, and all of them jumping on the bed on top of each other. And Andrew Young said, we had pillow fights all the time. And I just find that, and after the pillow fight, unfortunately, then they all go down to the parking lot, and Martin Luther King goes back up to his room to get his coat because it was a little cold. And that's when he's assassinated. But when they hear the shot, they thought it was a firecracker, and they thought Martin Luther King had dove to the ground pretending that he had been shot, and that he was still part of the same clowning that was continuing. And so, so I use the story partly to go against these social movement scholars who have really not talked about emotions very much, especially joy. And it's like, imagine the emotions of that hour, from frustration to, joy to, obviously, one of the greatest sorrows you can imagine. And, that's absolutely part of the social movement. And how do we, put all that together? And, but, when you talk to people who do human rights work and are activists, these kinds of pillow fights, in different forms happen all the time, and they have to. You can't do this work without having release. A friend of mine works.
Oh, somehow you're on mute. Bill, you muted yourself somehow.
Okay.
Oh,
wow.
And we're back.
Okay. So apparently I can't talk about immigration issues. So so a friend of mine works at the U.S.-Mexico border, and she works with a Catholic charity, and she hears all these stories from female migrants who come up and have been sexually assaulted on the journey. And I asked her about self-care, and she said, oh yeah, you know, something we really are worried about because our work is so traumatic, and you know, we're worried about secondary trauma. And I said, well, what do you do about that? She said, well, and the nuns she works with are in their 60s or 70s. And she says, every Friday night, me and the nuns, we go to one of their apartments and we drink margaritas and we dance all night. And I'm like, you know, I always want to have that image in my mind of these nuns who, to me, these women are, I mean, they're saints. I mean, these are incredible women who have done such great work for years with migrants. And it's like, you know, that picture of them dancing, drinking margaritas and listening to La Cucaracha or something is just, you know, how can you have a human rights movement without stories like that?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Where I kind of just looked up and we're at an hour. I want to keep talking about this. That those reminders of play and that story of the pillow fight also wrote, you know, I think does such a beautiful job of showing that full range of expression that we talked about earlier, that feeling of frustration and of working closely on a team with someone, being aligned in a cause and having, you know, having those moments that's like, hey, why haven't you responded? And what starts as a can then become a game. And if we're open to it, the play can happen. And then also at one point you write that play requires as much organizing, trust, and negotiation as any other protest or intervention. And so I hope that, Hannah, as we go forward in this week, we can hold both of those things: the space for spontaneous play and spontaneous expression, but then also that that curiosity around how can we organize more play